We have the pleasure and the zechus of discussing together a little bit about this great mitzvah of Kriyas HaTorah. Kriyas HaTorah, which is of such major significance that we on Monday and Thursday, we say V'urachom, and afterwards Kriyas HaTorah. The Yeshivas brings down that in Yemois Kedem, in generations bygone, it was on the other way around. First Kriyas HaTorah and then V'urachom. Why does V'urachom come after Kriyas HaTorah? Because, says the Yeshivas, Kriyas HaTorah has to be done exactly. You got to do it right. If you make the slightest mistake in Kriyas HaTorah, you've done an Aveira. V'hu rachum yechaper avoin is a request to the Rebbeinu Shalom to be moichel any Aveiras we might have done in the Aveira of not doing Kriyas HaTorah right. That gives a bit of a perspective of how important it is to get the Kriyas HaTorah right. The Pasuk says, when they came to the Evan, there was a be'er outside the town. V'nei be'er basada u'shloisha edrei tzoin, and there were 3 groups, flocks of sheep, roivtzim oleo, crouching around the be'er. Mimeno yashku kol adorim, all the different flocks take from the same well. V'golalu es ha'evan, they would roll off the stone from on top of the well. And from there, yashku kol adorim, all the sheep would drink. Says the Medrash, this pasuk is a remez to our mitzvah of Kriyas HaTorah. V'hinei be'er basada, there's a be'er, a wellspring of life, which is there in the field. We go through life with its difficulties and its challenges. Basada, in the great wide world. And in the middle of the sada, there's a be'er, a spring of fresh water. V'rov tzushama shloisha edrei tzoin. 3 flocks refer to the 3 oilim who are oile la Torah. These 3 people represent the tzibur. And from there, yashku kol adorim, all the people in shul gain and derive sustenance and fresh water and further energy to keep them going from the Kriyas HaTorah. Kriyas HaTorah is so important that the Zohar says, we look at Kriyas HaTorah, a little passing fleeting moment for 5 minutes, 3 people come up and have a Kriyas HaTorah. No, there's an Evan Gedola al Pi Be'er. We are subject to a Yetzer Hara, and the Yetzer Hara at all times tries to cover over our feelings of Yiddishkeit and our natural affinity to spiritualism and ruchnias. And when it comes to Kriyas HaTorah, v'golalu es ha'even me'al pi ha'be'er, Kriyas HaTorah has the ability to roll off the stone of the Yetzer Hara and give us the opportunity to drink the words of Torah, and in this way propel us forward in the rest of the day. The Zohar says that after Kriyas HaTorah, the parsha that we learn goes up to the Kisei HaKavod and intercedes on our behalf and says, this Yid, this Yankel was there at Kriyas HaTorah, he deserves that HaKadosh Baruch Hu should help him. And the next Yid was also there and also deserves that HaKadosh Baruch Hu should help him. V'golalu es ha'evan me'al pi ha'be'er, the parsha itself goes up to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and intercedes on our behalf. If Kriyas HaTorah is so great that it provides nourishment for us, and the parsha goes and intercedes on our behalf, so much so that if you got it wrong, there was a takana of asking V'urachum yechaper avoin. Let us try to focus on this mitzvah and learn a bit about the halachas of Kriyas HaTorah. We start with the Gemara in Megillah. Let us see, maybe you know your way around this kovetz better than I do. Here we have, on page number 15, we have the first reference in the Gemara. The Mishnah says in Daf Chaf Aleph Amud Aleph, HaKoires HaMegillah, the person leans the Megillah, Oimid v'yoshev. You can either stand or sit. Kriyas HaMegillah, we're coming there in a few weeks, can be done standing or sitting, however you might wish to do the mitzvah. Says the Gemara, first piece of the Gemara straight after the Mishnah, Tana, we learned in a Braisa, Masha'ein kein b'Torah. Torah doesn't have, Kriyas HaTorah doesn't have the same status as the Megillah. Megillah you can lay standing, sitting, however you like. Masha'ein kein b'Torah, you got to stand for Kriyas HaTorah. And the Gemara goes on to learn this from a pasuk, V'ato poi amoid imodi. Hashem says to Moshe Rabbeinu, Kriyas HaTorah you have to stand. This is the Gemara. There's many different mitzvahs. Some of them are like Megillah, stand or sit, please yourself. Some of them, like Kriyas HaTorah, has to be standing. Many mitzvahs have to be standing. Some have to be dafka sitting. Birchas Hamazon, you have to sit. Dayanim, when they sit in their capacity as judges, they have to sit. We all know, Erev Rosh Hashanah, we go to, after davening, 3 people, and Shimon Rabbi said, Dayanim mumchem, I asked the Dayanim to be matem adorim. And they say, mutalach, mutalach, mutalach. For sure, when they say the mutalach, they have to be sitting, because they are acting as a beis din, and a beis din has to be sitting. We appear in front of them, we stand. There's a question in the poskim. Very often there's a shuffling of seats at the time when you switch from person to person. Shimon or Rabbi said, Dayanim. So when I say the Shimon or Rabbi, I address them as Dayanim, do they already have to be sitting? Or can they still be standing and milling around, as long as when they say mutalach, mutalach, then they're functioning as a beis din and they're actually sitting? A question in the poskim. There's a very interesting tshuva of Rabbi Kivega. The Gemara says that usually Eidim function only as a means of proving that something did or didn't happen. Eidim come in front of the beis din and they testify that I did or I didn't lend money, borrow money, whatever it might be. But the lending of the money happened anyway, and the money is owed anyway. Beis din has to clarify and verify what happened, so we need 2 Eidim to testify. And there the Gemara learns from a pasuk that the Eidim have to stand. V'omdu shnei anoshim, they've got to stand when they testify. Rabbi Kivega writes in a tshuva, he's discussing there the unfortunate situation of chalitza. Chalitza, man died unfortunately without children. He left behind a brother and no children. So his wife, the almana, needs a chalitza from her brother-in-law. The Gemara says a chalitza has dayanim. You need dayanim to be present, not 3 but 5. And besides that, you also need Eidim. The Eidim have to be there, but not to be able to testify later, but in order to make it actually valid. There are various things which need Eidim to make them valid. If a man goes to a lady and there's nobody else there, nobody sees it, and he gives her a ring and he says, HARAV mukadeshesli, she won't be married. Gemara learns out, dava, that it's only valid, it only happens, the kiddushin, if there were 2 Eidim there at the time. So Rabbi Kivega writes in his tshuva that the 2 Eidim standing by the chuppah, or in his case, the 2 Eidim standing there by the chalitza, have to be standing because the pasuk says, V'omdu shnei anoshim, and Eidim have to stand. That's Rabbi Kivega in his tshuva. Interesting thing is that later, after he printed his tshuvas, Rabbi Kivega then added hashmotas, things which he either added, forgot to say at the time, or sometimes changed his mind. It's unusual, genius like Rabbi Kivega, who knew Kallah Torah Kula, should actually change his mind. But there's a few times when he did change his mind. And one of them is this tshuva. Rabbi Kivega changed his mind and he said, it's true, the pasuk says, V'omdu shnei anoshim, they have to stand to be Eidim. But, says Rabbi Kivega, when he changed his mind, that only applies to Eidim who are testifying in front of Beis Din. But if Eidim are standing there to make the Kiddushin work, or to make the Chalitza valid, there's no din that they've got to be standing. You can have your Eidim sitting as well if you want. Interesting is that the Eidim have to stand, but Dayanim have to sit. This makes things difficult by a Chalitza. It should never be relevant. Klal Yisrael shouldn't know of such things, but you have 5 Dayanim who have to see what's happening by a Chalitza. What's happening by a Chalitza? She's standing in front of her brother-in-law. The brother-in-law has his foot on the ground, and she needs to lift up his foot, take off the shoe, and spit in front of him. The most natural thing is when you want to watch somebody lifting up somebody else's foot from the floor, it's difficult when you're sitting on your chair. The natural thing is to stand up to be able to see, particularly if there's 5 of you and not everybody has a vantage position. Problem is, Dayanim have to be sitting. So a Chalitza has to be set up in such a way that Dayanim can sit and at the same time see the whole procedure that's happening. Be that as it may, there's other dinim which necessitate standing. Kriya, person unfortunately needs to tear Kriya, either for one of his 7 Kroivim, or he goes to the Mokim HaMikdash. Says the Shulchan Aruch, Kriya has to be done standing. You did it sitting, you're not Yotza. Many people, Friday night, stand when they say Vayechulu and sit for the rest of Kiddush, because Kiddush, according to their meaning, needs to sitting, either because you be moitzi other people, or because of Kiddush Mokum Suda, and yet they will stand for Vayechulu, because Vayechulu is testifying that HaKadosh Baruch Hu made the world. It needs to be B'Amidah. So we have various situations which necessitate dafka sitting, and others where you've got to be dafka standing. Says the Gemara here in Megillah, Kriyas HaMegillah, you can stand, you can sit, you do whatever you like. Yoshev v'oimet. But Kriyas HaTorah, the Pasuk says, Va'ata poi amoidi modi, dafka standing. That's mafurish. Now there's a problem. The Rambam, Perek Beis Mehilchas Megillah Alocha Zayin, brings a Yerushalayim. A din which is not written anywhere in the Gemara, but it's written in the Yerushalayim. The Yerushalayim says, when you're reading the Megillah for yourself, sitting at home reading the Megillah, so you read the Megillah by yourself, you can stand, you can sit, you do whatever you like. That's the Mishnah, Kriyas HaMegillah, Omer v'Yoshev. However, says the Yerushalmi, and the Rambam paskins this way, if you're laning the Megillah for the Tzibur, then you have to stand. Covered at Tzibur is Machayev you to stand. The Megillah itself doesn't need standing, but if you're standing, you'll be moitzi the Tzibur. The Tzibur deserves the honor, the recognition, the dignity that the person who's serving the Tzibur has to stand. You've got to stand for Kriyas HaMegillah. That's the Rambam. Frek the Turi Evan, frek the Bir Alocha, that l'ch'oira this Yerushalmi is against the Bavli. Why? Because we just saw a Gemara which says, the Mishnah says, HaKoyres HaMegillah, you can either stand or sit, please yourself. And then the Gemara says on that, in the name of a Brisa, this din, this leniency, this allowance to either sit or stand only applies to Kriyas HaMegillah, but Kriyas HaTorah has to be done standing. Frek de Bir Alocha, Kriyas HaTorah is always only b'tzibur. You can only have a Kriyas HaTorah with a tzibur. Kriyas HaTorah needs 10 people. We learn from a pasuk, Tzedavah Shebekdusha, or other reasons, you need 10 people. So when the Gemara contrasts Megillah and Kriyas HaTorah, we're not talking about a Yochid who reads the Megillah and a tzibur who's reading the Sefer Torah, because then you talk about 2 different things. What's the Gemara talking about? When's the Gemara making the difference between Megillah and Kriyas HaTorah? When there's a tzibur. A tzibur of the Megillah, you can either stand or sit. A tzibur of Kriyas HaTorah, you have to stand because the pasuk says, Va'ata poi amoidi modi. Asks the Bir Halacha, you see from our Gemara, the Bavli holds, that even a tzibur who's reading the Megillah, you're allowed to read the Megillah for a tzibur sitting down. So we're not disputing the fact that it says in Yerushalmi that Kriyas HaMegillah you've got to stand. The kasha is not on the Yerushalmi, but on the Rambam. How can the Rambam paskin that if you read for the tzibur, you've got to read for the tzibur a Megillah standing, If that's the case, then there's no difference between Megillah and Kriyas HaTorah. And the Gemara, our Gemara Bavli, that we always paskin like, says Mefurish that there's a difference between Megillah and Kriyas HaTorah. So the Gemara must be talking about a tzibur. That's the first kasha on the Rambam. We move on now to a kasha on a Gemara, and afterwards a kasha on a posuk, and then in Mitzvah Hashem we try to put all the pieces together. There's a Gemara in Brochus, Daf Lamed Aleph Amud Beis, where the Gemara says as follows. At the time when a person davens, we know you daven Shemona Esrei, you have to stand for Shemona Esrei. Oimid b'fnei HaMelech, the covet of standing in front of HaKadosh Baruch Hu demands of us, we have to stand for Shemona Esrei. So much so that there's even a tzad in the poskim, in the Rishonim, that if a person davens Shemona Esrei sitting down, he might have to repeat the Shemona Esrei. Shemona Esrei needs to be standing. Says the Gemara Din, that we know, we're very aware of, that not only the person who's davening Shemona Esrei has to stand, but the people around him also have to stand. You're not allowed to sit down in front of somebody who is davening Shemona Esrei. A question, does it mean directly in front? Does it mean on the sides? Does it mean all around? That's not the point right now. The Gemara says that if you're near somebody who's davening Shemona Esrei, you have to stand. How do we know, says the Gemara? We'll learn it from a pasuk. Chana came to daven in the Beis HaMikdash. Sadly, she didn't have children. Tragically, a broken heart, she comes to the Beis HaMikdash, which was then in Shiloh, to pour out her heart and daven to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Many dinim of tefillah are learned from her tefillah. You've got to daven, you've got to say it quietly, you've got to daven. Many dinim are learned from her tefillah. She davened a Shemona Esrei to Hashem. She came back later to Eli HaKohen, who was the Kohen Gadol at the time, whom we know famously was there and witnessed her and had a whole discussion with her and initially misunderstood what she was doing and thought that she wasn't davening the way she should be. And she says to Eli the Kohen Gadol, Anoichi ha'isha, I am the lady, Hanitzeves imcha, who was standing together with you, koi. We were standing together here in Shiloh. Says the Gemara, Chana standing, we understand that. She davened Shemona Esrei. I stood together with you, Eli. Anoichi ha'isha hanitzeves imcha. I'm standing with you. Why should Eli be standing? Why does Eli have to stand? Let Eli sit. It's more comfortable to sit. So we see from here that there must have been a halacha which demanded of Eli he has to stand. Why, says the Gemara? It must be that the halacha says if you're near a person who's davening Shemona Esrei, you have to stand. Onoichi ha'isha hanitzeves imcha, I'm standing, I was standing here with you. Not only I stood for Shemona Esrei, but you also had to stand because you were within Daled Amos of me. That's the Gemara in Brachos, Daf Lamed Aleph Amud Beis. Halacha that we all know, you've got to stand up. The Yeshivas Yankiv, the MEIR Tzia, ask a kasha. There's a Gemara in many places in Shas, which says a rule. Ein yeshiva ba'azara, you're not allowed to sit in the azara, ela lemalchei beis David bilvad. Only the kings who are descendant from David HaMelech are allowed to sit in the azara. Everybody else, the covered, the dignity of the azara, demands that we have to stand. If so, says the Yeshivas Yaakov, the azara which demands of me to stand is not only the azara on the Temple Mount in Yerushalayim, because it's the Beis HaMikdash. Why do you have to stand? Ein yeshiva b'azara ela malchei beis, because it's the place of Asheras HaShechina. The place of Asheras HaShechina is in the Beis HaMikdash, in Shiloh, in Noiv, in Givon, in the Mishkan, wherever there's a Beis HaMikdash. If so, Chana and Eli are at this point in the azara. The azara already demands that both of them need to stand. So what did the Gemara have? We have a pasuk which says, so she has to stand, but why does he have to stand? You know why he has to stand? The only reason why he has to stand is because he's within Daled Amos of somebody who's davening Shemona Esrei. Who says? Maybe the reason why Eli had to stand can stand anyway, because he's not a descendant of Malchei Beis David. Ein yeshiva b'azara ela lemalchei Beis David bilvad. That's the kasha of the Yeshuas Yaakov and the MEIR K'tzia. So we have question 1, a kash on the Rambam, in the dinim of Amida by Kriyas HaTorah. Question 2, question on the Gemara. How can the Gemara prove that you have to stand within Daled Amos of a person daven Shemona Esrei? Question 3 is a kash on a posuk. We're going back. Kash on a Rambam, kash on a Gemara, and now a kash on a posuk. A simple kash, it's not my kasha. The Medrash Shoich HaToiv asks a kasha. And Tosfos brings it down. The pasuk says, not in this story, pasuk elsewhere says, Ve'eli hakohen yoshev beveis Hashem. Eli hakohen is sitting there in the Beis Hashem, in the Azorah. As Tosfos a kasha, Eli is not a king. He's not a king from Malchei Beis David. And the pasuk says explicitly about Eli that he's sitting in the Beis Hashem. How could he be sitting if we have a rule that Ein Yeshiva L'Azorah Elo L'Malchei Beis David Bilvad? Now, the Medrash learns from here an incredible chiddush. The Medrash says, Ein Yeshiva L'Azorah Elo L'Malchei Beis David, or a Kohen Gadol. A Kohen Gadol is allowed to sit down. So therefore, the pasuk says, Ve'eli hakohen yoshev. Eli is allowed to sit down. Stop here for a minute. If this would be agreed by our Gemara, then we would be able to answer question number 2. Because if the halacha is a Kohen Gadol is allowed to sit down, if Eli is allowed to sit down, and nevertheless Chanus says to Eli, Anoicha isha TZVI imcha kai, so why is he standing? It must be because he's within Daled Amos of somebody who is daven Shemona Esrei. What's the problem? The Gemara in Soita Daf Mem Amud Beis speaks about the Kohen Gadol who on Yom Kippur would lean from the Sefer Torah. And when he leaned from the Sefer Torah, it says in the Mishnah in Yuma that he would sit down and read from the Sefer Torah. The Gemara in Soita Daf Mem Amud Beis asks a kasha, how can you tell me that the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur sits down to read for the tzibur on Yom Kippur? He's standing in the Azorah, and we have a rule, Ein Yeshiva B'Azorah Elo L'Malchei Beis David Bilvad. What do we see from this Gemara? That the Gemara argues on the Medrash. The Gemara takes the phrase literally. Ein Yeshiva L'Azorah Elo L'Malchei Beis David means only kings and nobody else, not even a Kohen Gadol. If we prove that the Gemara holds that you're not allowed to sit in the Azorah, no one, not even a Kohen Gadol, then we immediately have 2 problems. Problem 2, if our Gemara holds that a Kohen Gadol is not allowed to sit in the Azorah, then how can our Gemara learn from the pasuk Anoichi ha'isha TZVI imcha kai, if our Gemara holds that even a Kohen Gadol has to stand in the Azorah? And the next question is question 3, a pasuk in Tanakh. The pasuk says explicitly, Ve'eli hakohen yoshev. Eli hakohen is sitting. How can the pasuk say Eli hakohen yoshev if our Gemara holds that Ein Yeshiva B'Azorah Elo L'Malchei Beis David means literally only kohenim and not only kings from Beis David and not even a Kohen Gadol? So we have one kasha on the Rambam in the dinim of Kriyas HaTorah, and one kasha on our Gemara and Brachos in the dinim of standing up for somebody who's within Daled Amos of somebody who's daven Shemona Esrei. And then we have a kasha which is really the kasha of the Medrash. How can the pasuk say Ve'eli hakohen yoshev, and we know that you're not allowed to sit in Nazarah? To try to, before we answer this, I want to add a little point from the Tribuna Rav. The Tribuna Rav brings a little smach, if we can say that, to the opinion of the Medrash. The Medrash holds that a Kohen Gadol is allowed to sit just like a king, but nobody else. Only a king and a Kohen Gadol. So the Tribuna Rav brings a pasuk in which Hashem says to Aaron, I want you to bring korbanos, and you and your children, the Kohanim, you should do all the avodah in the Beis HaMikdash. You should do the Zrika, and you should do the Kabbalah, and you should do the Halacha, and you should do the Haktara. All the avodah of korbanos is for Aaron and his sons. When you finish doing all this, you've done your Zrika, Haktorah, Hoilocha. Now comes the Kodshim. Kodshe Kadoshim have to be eaten by a Kohen. And the Pasuk says, V'hoy alacha, Hashem says to Aaron, V'hoy alacha, all this meat will be for you, Aaron, L'moshcha, to eat it in a way of L'moshcha, in a way of Gedula, in a way which sanctifies and shows your superiority, Ulevonecha, and your sons, the Kohanim, also. From this pasuk we learn that the Kohen has to eat the korban in a dignified manner. You can't eat the meat half raw, you can't eat the meat half cold. It's got to be eaten in the most presentable, bekovedik way. Because the pasuk says L'moshcha, and from L'moshcha the Gemara learns it's got to be done in a dignified manner. The question is that the pasuk is strange in the build-up of the pasuk. V'hoya lecha l'moshcha ulevanecha. The pasuk ought to say V'hoya lecha ulevanecha l'moshcha, but not the l'moshcha between lecha and bonecha. Says the Shebina Rav that according to the opinion of the Medrash, we understand, because l'moshcha means eat it in the most presentable way, the most respectable way. The meat has to be well cooked. It's got to taste good. And the person who's eating it has to sit. Who is able to sit in the Azara? Only the Kohen Gadol, not the Kohanim, according to the Medrash. So therefore the Pasuk says, V'haya lecha, you Aaron, you should eat l'moshcha. You are the epitome of l'moshcha because you can eat sitting down as well. Ulevanecha, and your children, as much as they are able to be l'moshcha, which means that the meat has to taste nice, but they are not able to do so sitting. Okay, that's what Shebina Rav. But we want to get back and try and answer our Bavli. Our Bavli clearly holds that a Kohen, even a Kohen Gadol, is not allowed to sit in the Azara. How come Eli is sitting? In order to answer this, we need to see a Gemara in Shavuos and a Gemara in Zvachim. The Gemara in Shavuos, in Daf Lamed Amud Beis, tells us a story. Rav Nachman was a Dayan. He had a Din Torah. He had other Dayanim with him. And the Din Torah is between two people. We don't know one of the two sides, but one of the sides we know was the wife of Rav Huna. Rav Huna's wife is one of the two sides in the dispute. Now, the halacha says that if a Talmid Chacham walks in, you have to stand up for him. Like a Pasuk says, Mipnei Seva Tokim, you have to stand up, and we learn out from the Mipnei Seva Tokim V'Dartra P'nei Zokin, a Talmid Chacham walks in, you have to stand up. Says the Gemara in Shavuos, not only a Talmid Chacham, but there's a din, Eishes Chava Kachava, you have to stand up for an Eishes Chava. So Mrs. Rav Huna walks in, Rav Nachman needs to stand up for her. But Rav Nachman didn't want to stand up completely for her because the Gemara has whole considerations over there. The other side will get put out and feel that I'm standing up and be mechabed one side more than the other. He didn't want to stand up completely. So what did he do? He lifted himself up on his stick. He leans on his stick like he's tying up his shoe. He's somewhere between standing and sitting. So it's called that he's stood up for a Talmid Chacham, even though he's leaning, and he's leaning on his stick, but at least he's not sitting down. That's Gemara number one, a Gemara in Shavuos. On the other hand, there's a Gemara in Zvachim. The Gemara talks in Zvachim about Kiddush Yodayim V'Raglayim. Kiddush Yodayim V'Raglayim is a difficult avodah in which the Kohen has to put his hands over his feet and get his hands washed and his feet before he does the avodah. Now, it's difficult to get your hands in a position over your feet and get them washed and balanced at the same time. So the Gemara suggests that rather than demanding that the Kohen has to stand, let him lean on something. And when you're leaning, it's far easier to hold yourself supported on something and do Kiddush Yadayim V'Raglayim. Says the Gemara, no, we can't do that. You can't be leaning when you do Kiddush Yadayim V'Raglayim. Why? Because we have halacha in the avodah of a Kohen where the Pasuk says, La'amoid l'sharis lifnei Hashem. Whenever you do an avodah in front of Hashem, you have to be standing. And standing is only called standing if you're completely erect. If you're leaning on a stender like this, then that's not called La'amoid l'sharis lifnei Hashem. So the Magen Avraham asks a kasha. What is the halachic status of a person who's leaning heavily on a chair, a stender, or a table? We have a Gemara in Shavuos which says that you need to stand up for a Talmid Chacham. It's called standing up when you're leaning heavily. We have another Gemara in Zvachim talking about a Kohen who needs to do avodah in the Beis HaMikdash. It would be much easier to lean on his stick. And the Gemara says, no, it says in the Pasuk, Lamed l'sharis, and Lamed l'sharis demands standing properly. What do we do with this stira two Gemaras? It's interesting, by the way, before we go to the answer over here, Hagoyin Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, Zichron Levrocha, was a Boki all over, and particularly in his beautiful Sfarim on Tanakh. Most famous is his Emes LeYaakov on Chamisha Chumshe Torah. Less famous, but equally beautiful, is his Sefer Emes LeYaakov on Nevi'im and Ksuvim. On the Nevi'im, the beautiful Sefer Emes LeYaakov from Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky. And in his typical, incisive way, he asks kashas on psukim which we might not otherwise have noticed. Psukim which we say all the time in the Torah and we repeat all the time. We don't even think, don't realize the kasha. Elisha, we know, had a story. He brought back to life a little boy. The mother comes crying to Elisha, my son died. So he instructs his Talmid Gechazi, Kach es mishanti, take my stick, place it on the little boy, and he'll wake up. How the story continues isn't relevant to us. That's probably why we don't realize, because we're looking at the rest of the story. So Rabbi Yaakov has a very interesting ha'ara. Most of us walk around, Baruch Hashem, without sticks. Elisha evidently has a stick. Kach es mishanti, take my stick. Why does Elisha have a stick? He's an old man. He can't walk without a stick. I'll prove to you he can walk without a stick, because he gave his stick to Gehazi and he told him, put it on that kid. And 5 minutes later, the next pasuk says that Elisha himself turns up. So how did he turn up? Nobody drove him there. He walked there. So Elisha can get around without a stick. So why do you have a stick? So if Rabbi Yaakov would have been a little bit more Hasidish, he would have said, the Rebbe has a zilben stecken because a Rebbe has a zilben stecken. But that doesn't seem to have even passed through his mind. You have a stick if you need a stick, if it has some sort of purpose. If it's not doing something, you don't need a stick. So why does Elisha have a stick? That's Rabbi Yaakov's kasha. And he answers on the lines of the Gemara that we just said. He says that the situations when halachically you don't want to be standing or sitting, which is really the Gemara that we just had in Shavuos, where Rav Nachman he couldn't sit and he couldn't stand. What did he do? He was leaning on a stick. So Elisha, for such situations, had a stick that he should be able to support himself and lean on something for situations where the halacha demands it. The typical way Rabbi Yaakov will learn a pasuk in the Navi, that there's a halachic reason for the stick that Elisha had. So the Magen Avraham has a problem. Make up your mind. What's the din of leaning? Is leaning treated as standing, like the Gemara seems to say in Shavuos, that you're called standing up for Talmid Chacham if you're leaning? And on the other hand, the Gemara in Zvachim says that you can't do Kiddush Yadayim V'Raglayim while leaning. Says the Magen Avraham, a Pashta teretz. It depends why the Torah says you need to stand. In cases where the Torah says that you should stand to be mechabed, says the Magen Avraham, the Torah says don't sit down. As long as you stand, as long as you're not sitting, that's good enough. A dugma l'dova, in parentheses, we know there's a situation when you should stand up for your father who walks in, but he's moichel you don't need to stand up, but lift yourself up out of your chair. Show that you would have liked to have stood up. Says the Magen Avraham, when the Torah demands of me to be mechabed a Talmid Chacham, to be mechabed the wife of Rav Huna, that means Don't sit. Show that you want to be mechabed. Whether you stand fully erect or you're leaning, you'll be mechabed her anyway. But when the Torah wants amida, when the Torah demands of me standing, such as avoid and beis hamikdash, lamoid l'shoros lifnei Hashem, amida, that needs to be a full standing, not even leaning. The poskim add to what the Magen Avraham says, and they say a very interesting difference in expression. When the Torah talks about standing, when you do the avodah, the lashon of the Torah is lamoid l'shoros lifnei Hashem. The word amida, to be completely standing. When the Torah says to be mechaber talmid chacham, it doesn't say mipnei seva ta'amoid. The pasuk says mipnei seva takum. Takum means raise yourself. How you raise yourself? You can raise yourself partially, completely, leaning, not leaning, doesn't matter. As long as you're not sitting. As long as you're not sitting, that's called mipnei seva takum. Standing, that needs a full standing. Lamoid l'shoros lifnei Hashem. There's a gewaltige Wort of Maril Diskin, brings a raya, not Maril Diskin, sorry, the Buchacha, Emile the Chasidusa, brings a raya to this Nakuda, that there's a difference between Amida and Kimo. When the Torah says, Lamoid l'shoros, that means full standing. When the Torah says, when they say takum, takum means show an expression of respect, which even leaning is good enough. How do I know? Says the Buchacha, I'll prove it to you from a pasuk in the Torah. The pasuk in Parashas Mishpatim is talking about you hit your eved, you do pay, you don't pay, you chayiv misa, not chayiv misa. So the pasuk says, Im yokum, if he gets up out of bed, Im yokum v'his halech bachutz, and he goes walking al mishantoi, on his stick, Im yokum v'shalich b'chutz al mishantoi v'niko hamake, then the person who hit him isn't chayiv misa because this fellow recovered. Rakshiv tayitim v'rape, you got to beis shevas and ripui. So what's the pasuk talking about? The pasuk says Im yokum, this fellow stood up out of bed, but he's not fully recovered. V'shalich b'chutz al mishantoi, he's leaning on his stick. So the pasuk says explicitly that the man is leaning on his stick. Well, how does the pasuk refer to him? Im yakum. It doesn't say im yamoid, because you can't say im yamoid v'eshalech b'chutz al mishantoi. Because if you're oimed without a stick. Im yakum, you stood up that you're not sitting down anymore. V'eshalech b'chutz al mishantoi. Says the Magen Avraham, when it's covered, when it's a mipnei seva takum, then leaning is good enough. When there's a din of an amida, that's got to be full standing without even leaning. Once that's the case, we can start with our Rambam by Kriyas HaTorah and then work through our kashas.
Could you just say the chiluk by the Rambam is that the Gemara says like Kriyas HaTorah because by Megillah it's a din l'chadchila b'diavad. In other words, l'chadchila you should stand, but b'diavad it's okay if you don't. And maybe by Kriyas HaTorah even b'diavad
you wouldn't be yotza if you were standing. So if you were sitting. There are those who suggest that, but it's dependent on both dinim being right. Firstly, that it's only a chatchila by Megillah, and secondly, that it's ma'akav by Kriyas HaTorah. So the question is, which I said, I quote the name of Turi Evan, the Bir Halacha in Siman Tov Reish Tzadi suggests your answer, and actually wants to prove from here that it's only a din l'chatchila by the Megillah, but he's not so sure about it, and there's many rayas actually that that's not what the Rambam meant. But the possibility exists. Now let's go back.
Is it because it seems from the Yerushalayim leaning where if you took away the shtani.
We'll come to that. Mitzvah Hashem, hopefully you're on the ball. Hopefully we'll get there. So we come to our Rambam when we come to the Kash of the Turei Even. The Rambam brings Yerushalmi, which says that you have to stand for Kriyas Megillah. And our Gemara says that there's a difference between Megillah and Kriyas HaTorah. And obviously we're talking about Kriyas Megillah when you're leaning for a tzibur. How can the Gemara say there's a difference between Kriyas HaMegillah and Kriyas HaTorah, if the Rambam holds that we agree to the Yerushalmi that you have to stand for Kriyas HaMegillah. And the answer is very simple. Why do you stand for Kriyas HaMegillah? Not because Megillah needs, only because it's a tzibur. So you're standing because of kavod. Are you able to read for the tzibur leaning on a shtender like this? Yes, as long as you're not sitting, that's good enough. If I stand for a Talmid Chacham, I'm allowed to lean. So if I stand for the tzibur, I'm allowed to lean. What about Kriyas HaTorah? Kriyas HaTorah, we learn from a pasuk, Va'ata poi amoidi modi. If there's a din of Amida, then you've got to stand and you can't even lean. Says the Gemara that this leniency of Megillah applies to Megillah, but Kriyas HaTorah is more chomor, more strict. Why more strict? Because by Megillah, even if we agree to the Yerushalmi that you're not allowed to sit, but you don't need to stand, you're allowed to lean. Masha'enk in Kriyas HaTorah, you have to stand. Let's see how meduyuk it is in the Rambam, Rabbi Isai. Let's see if we can find the Rambam in this beautiful kuntras over here. Here we are. Where's the Rambam gone over here? Page 376. Brilliant. 376. Oh, says I see you already had a share on this. It says the Rambam, Beis Milchas Megillah, Halacha Zayin. Kara oimed or yoshev. If you read the Megillah either standing or sitting yotza, vafilu b'tzibur, even b'tzibur, aval lo yikra b'tzibur, but you should not read b'tzibur yoshev. You shouldn't read for the tzibur sitting. If I would have written the Rambam, I would have written v'chayev lamoid k'shakayre b'tzibur. Does the Rambam say you have to stand? No. What does he say, the Rambam? What's the whole din over here, the cover of the tzibur is, lo yeshiv, don't sit down. As long as you're not sitting, we don't care, because you're being mechabed them. How you mechabed them, we don't mind. You're either standing or leaning. When it comes to Kriyas HaTorah, the Rambam doesn't say lo yeshiv for Kriyas HaTorah. What does he say? You got to read the Kriyas HaTorah ba'amida, yamoid for Kriyas HaTorah. So therefore, we found for the stira, the Gemara, and the Rambam. We move on to the next kasha that we had on the Gemara in Brachos. The Gemara in Brachos says, Onoichi ha'isha hanitzeves imcha koi. The two of us, Eli and Chana, were both standing here. Mikan, says the Gemara, that within the aladamas of a person's davrish ben esra, you have to stand. How do you know? Frek the Yeshua's Yaakov. Maybe the reason why they were both standing is because Ein Yeshiva Bazara Ela Lamalche B'Stavir Revad. And the answer is very simple. The din of standing in the Azara is not because you need to stand. It doesn't say in the Gemara Chayovim La'amoid Ba'Azara. You have to be mechabed the place. In which way are you mechabed the place? The Gemara says explicitly, Ein Yeshiva Ba'Azara. You're not allowed to sit down. Be allowed to lean. The Azara allows you to lean. What did Chanos say to Eli? Onoichi ha'isha hanitzeves imcha koi. You and me were both standing. Why is she standing? Because she davened Shemona Esra. And Shemona Esra has its din of oimed bifnei hamelech. You have to stand because you're standing in front of the king. So why does she say Onoichi ha'isha hanitzeves imcha? Both of us, you and me, were both standing here. If it's only because you're not allowed to sit in the Azara, then she would have to stand because she's davening Shemona Esra. And Eli is not allowed to sit, but he doesn't need to stand the same as her. If she says, Onoichi o isha hanitzeves imcha, that both of us were standing, it means that Eli wasn't even leaning. Why is Eli standing? The answer is because it's not just a covered. It's because, like the mispalel is on Oimed Bifnei HaMelech, so within Daladamas is also called in front of the Shechina. And in front of the Shechina you have to stand. So Eli was standing fully erect. Why is Eli standing fully erect? Why isn't it good enough to lean? From here we learn that the reason why Eli was standing was because there's a din that you have to stand in a mokum of the Shechina, and that is within 4 amos of a person who's davening Shemona Esra.
Comes out that the din of standing by the spowel is more than the din of the Azara, which is not like Yeshua.
Correct. correct. But if we had the time, there's many rise to that. That's 100% correct what you just said. Now comes the next thing, the pasuk. The Medrash asks a kasha on the pasuk. The pasuk says, "Ve'eli hakoyin yoshev." How can you say Eli hakoyin yoshev? Ein yeshiva ba'azara el malchi b'sdavid bilvad. And the answer is pashat. When the pasuk says Eli hakoyin yoshev, doesn't mean literally standing. It means compared to those people who are standing because they're davening a Shemona Esra, Eli hakoyin yoshev is halachically called that he's sitting because he is leaning. So far is so good. Baruch Hashem, everything is miyushav. Now, we have to continue. That it's not as simple as all this. Because there is another kasha on the shitta of the Ramah. We've said so far the shitta of the Magen Avraham. Magen Avraham has two Gemaras, and the Magen Avraham decides that the difference is if it's because of covered, then leaning is allowed. But where you need Amida needs to be standing. That's the opinion of Magen Avraham, which we just discussed. The Magen Avraham explicitly argues with the Ramah. The Ramah is talking about where there's a din of an Amida, and nevertheless he says you're allowed to lean. The Ramah is in Choshen Mishpat, and it says in Shulchan Aruch that you need to stand when you give Eidos. Eidos needs standing. V'omdu shnei anoshim. And nevertheless, the Ramah says the Eidim are allowed to lean. So what do we see from the Ramah? That the Ramah holds that you're always allowed to lean, even when the Torah says Amida. There's an immediate kasha in all the Achronim. In Shulchan Aruch Orach Chaim Siman Kuf Mem Aleph, in the dinim of Kriyas HaTorah, it says you have to stand for Kriyas HaTorah. Okay, that's a Mefurish Gemara we just saw. Va'ata poya moidi modi. And the Shulchan Aruch says there that when the Baal Koreh leans, he's not even allowed to lean. That's the Shulchan Aruch. And the Ramah doesn't add a word, doesn't argue. Seemingly, evidently, the Ramah agrees that Kriyas HaTorah, where it says, Va'ata poi amoidi modi, you've got to stand, not even to lean. But the Ramah himself in Choshen Mishpat, when it says in Shulchan Aruch that the Eidim have to stand, because it says in the pasuk, V'omdu shnei anoshim, there the Ramah allows a person to lean. What do we do with what appears to be a stira in the Ramah? Not an explicit stira in the Ramah, but we have a Ramah who allows standing for the Kriya, for the Eidim, and the Ramah doesn't say anything when the Shulchan Aruch says that Kriyas HaTorah you're not allowed to lean. So there's an Oilas Tomid, which I repeat, not because we pass in this way, but because it gives us a bit of a concept of what Kriyas HaTorah is all about. Says the Oilas Tomid, the Ramah holds as follows. Whenever it's a din d'Rabbanan that you need to stand, then you're allowed to lean. So, Eidim, although we learn from Pasuk of Omdu Shnei Anoshim, the Ramah holds that Pasuk is an asmachta. It's a din d'Rabbanan. The Chachamim said that the Eidim have to stand. If it's a din d'Rabbanan, then it's good enough. You're allowed to lean. However, says the Oilas Tomid, Kriyas HaTorah, the Baal Koreh stands for Kriyas HaTorah. Then when the Gemara learns, Va'ata poya moidi modi, this is not a takana d'Rabbanan that the Baal Koreh needs to stand. This is a din d'Iraisa. Kriyas HaTorah is of such incredible value that there's a din d'Iraisa that the Baal Koreh has to stand. If it's din d'Iraisa, then it's got to be Ba'amida, even according to the Ramah. This is the opinion of the Oilas Tomid. However, the Eliyah Rabbah says a different teretz. And this Eliyah Rabbah is very useful to us for our kasha. The Eliyah Rabbah brings a further din, which is the din you just mentioned. That the Shulchan Aruch says in Kuf Mem Aleph by Kriyas HaTorah that Kriyas HaTorah you have to stand and you can't lean, and even a little bit of leaning in a way which if you pulled it away I would be standing anyway. So I don't need this to stay erect, but nevertheless, a little bit of slouching, a little bit of support. But it's not a support that I'm leaning in such a way that I'm absolutely dependent on it, and otherwise I would fall down. Says the Shulchan Aruch, even that much leaning is not allowed by Kriyas HaTorah. In all other dinim of Amida, when the Torah says you have to stand, you have to stand. So there's a din you have to stand, but nobody ever said that you're not allowed to lean, even in a way that will have no effect on you. You can stand anyway. Kriyas HaTorah has this din. Why? So the Magen Avraham brings a Yerushalmi. Yerushalmi says, Kriyas HaTorah is different. Kriyas HaTorah, mishum eimo. You have to demonstrate the fear of going through a Kriyas HaTorah. Kriyas HaTorah is not just any old mitzvah that you do. Kriyas HaTorah is the closest we can get to Matan Torah. Like HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave the Torah on Har Sinai to Klal Yisrael. So we are allowed to play out the Matan Torah in a smaller way in our own shul with Kriyas HaTorah. But Kriyas HaTorah is to be done in a way which demonstrates the pachad of Asheras HaShechina. We find many rayas that our Kriyas HaTorah mirrors Matan Torah. We know there's a din in Shulchan Aruch, which says that the Bal Korah has to prepare the laning. It's not good enough to just turn up, walk into the shul, I walk over to Sefer Torah. You've got to prepare it. Says the Medrash Tanchuma, why do you need to prepare it? Because the Pasuk says when Hashem gave us the Torah, Ozra v'tikei HaKadosh Baruch Hu prepared the Torah before he gave it to us. Yeah. Mipnei Eimo. We have to demonstrate how scared we are. Okay. So just like one was for Matan Torah and the other one was for Kriyas HaTorah. So just like by Matan Torah Hashem prepared before, the Bal Korah needs to prepare before. The next, we take out the Sefer Torah, we say Gadol Hashem iti, 40 oisias. Why 40 oisias? Just like Matan Torah needed 40 days of preparation, 40 oisias in Gadol Hashem iti, 40 words in the brachas that you say. Well, we can swap Maramakomis at another time about the different midrashim about Gadlu and the brachas of the Torah. And then we find a din that by Kriyas HaTorah, you need to have 3 people standing there on the bima. Alidei Sirsur. There's a Bal Korah, and there's an Oila, and there's somebody who's calling up a Gabba. Why? Just like Matan Torah was Alidei Sirsur, Hashem gave the Torah through Moshe to Klal Yisrael, so also our Kriyas HaTorah. Various other dinim which are built to mirror the ceremony of Matan Torah, before the laning, during the laning, and even after. So therefore, says the Eliyah Rabbah, Kriyas HaTorah that we have is to mirror the original Matan Torah. The original Matan Torah, Mishum Eima HaKadosh Baruch Hu is bringing his Shechina onto Har Sinai. There you've got to be standing absolutely erect, not even supported in any way. Says the Eliyah Rabbah, if you see that Kriyas HaTorah has this extra din, that you're not even allowed to lean in a way where you don't need the support, then obviously we don't have anymore a stira between the Ramah in Choshen Mishpat and the Shulchan Aruch in Kriyas HaTorah. The Ramah's opinion is that whenever you need Amida, you're allowed to lean. You can lean completely, and the Eidim are allowed to stand and allowed to lean completely. It's perfectly okay. Why did the Ramah not say anything about Kriyas HaTorah? Because Kriyas HaTorah is not just a din of Amida. Kriyas HaTorah is a din of Eimah. You have to demonstrate fear. Fear means standing completely. According to the Eliyah Rabbah, we have another teretz on the kasha of the Turei Even. What did the Turei Even ask? That here the Gemara says, Masha Ein came by Kriyas HaTorah. There's a difference between Megillah and Kriyas HaTorah. Frek the Eliyah Rabbah, frek the Bir Alocha, if the Rambam says that whenever you lay in for a tzibur, you have to stand, so there's no difference anymore between Kriyas HaTorah and the Megillah. So we answered so far, if you say that when you stand for the tzibur, it's good tzibur to lean, then that's the din by the tzibur. Mashenki Kriyas HaTorah, you're not even allowed to lean. But what will be if somebody is going to hold that Kavod HaTzibur demands of me not just that I'm not allowed to sit? I'm going to have an opinion which might exist that Kavod HaTzibur demands standing. So if Kavod HaTzibur demands standing, then we're back to square one. There's no difference between Kriyas HaMegillah, where the Tzibur demands of me to stand, and Kriyas HaTorah, where the Pasuk says, Va'ata poya moidi modi. But according to the Eliyah Rabbah, which is actually the Shulchan Aruch, that Kriyas HaTorah has an extra din, that you're not even allowed to lean in a way that if you took it away would have no effect at all. But the actual fact that you're leaning is already not in place when you're trying to demonstrate fear of Hashem. If that's the case, then the Gemara obviously says, Mash'ein kein b'kriyas HaTorah, because Megillah, there's no din of fear. The maximum that there might be by Kriyas HaMegillah is to stand. So if you're going to hold that way, then the covet of the tzibur is that you can't lean in a way that you're absolutely dependent on your support. But a little bit of leaning is going to be allowed. Mash'ein kein Kriyas HaTorah, where there's an additional level, mipnei ema, then even in a way that it makes no difference, even if you take it away, you will not be allowed to do this. Where else do we find this? One other place, which is relevant to you, the Mishnah Berurah says in Siman Tzadi Daled, Shmona Esra. Shmona Esra, which is a oimid b'fnei HaMelech, says the Mishnah Berurah, has the same din as the Eliyah Rabbah says by Kriyas HaTorah. Even if in Kallah Torah Kula. When is it called leaning? If I'm leaning in a way that I need the support. But if I don't need the support, a little leaning is allowed generally. Says the Mishnah Berurah, when you're davening Shmona Esra is ka'oimid b'fnei HaMelech. Oimid b'fnei HaMelech, that means I have to demonstrate how scared I am of the fact that I'm speaking to the king himself. By Kriyas HaTorah, which is mirrored to be a replica of Matan Torah, and by Shmona Esra, which is there to be that I'm oimid b'fnei HaMelech, these two have this extra level that is mechayev me that I'm not even allowed to lean in the slightest little way. So according to the Eliyah Rabbah, we have an additional teretz to the kasha of Turei. Now, I don't want to be meirich, but I just want to add one or two little points.
The Mishnah Berurah said, one of your Maramachaimas, the Mishnah Berurah says that when the Torah is being carried in front of you,
yes,
he says smicha is not yeshiva. So,
correct.
But to say it's because it's not really Amor, because it's not the Kriyas HaTorah. If anything, it's like covered.
Zeyagut.
There the smicha should be like
Zeyagut, a very, very correct ha'ara, and we don't really know where the Mishnah Berurah got it from. If you really want the emes, I mean, now's not the time for it. The opinion of the Mishnah Berurah in this whole parsha of smicha, ki yeshiva or not, is a pella mamash. The Mishnah Berurah in 4, 5, 6 places, and it's extremely difficult to understand how he understood this sugya. Now's not the time for it, but it's extremely difficult. The way the Mishnah Berurah writes by Sfir Sa'oima and by Tkiyah Shofar, the one place where the Ramah allows it is by Tkiyah Shofar, and there the Mishnah Berurah is machmir. It's very, very difficult, the Mishnah Berurah's opinion. I just add over here, there's 3 forms of people by Kriyas HaTorah. There's the Balkaira, there's the man having the Aliyah, and there's the Tzibur. So the Balkaira, we already learned. The Balkaira, we have a Gemara which says, Mash'ein kein b'Kriyas HaTorah, and we have a Shulchan Aruch which says that the Balkaira has to stand, and he's not allowed to lean, and he's not even allowed to lean in a way that he doesn't need it. It's like Matan Torah. Brilliant. Then we have the Oila, the fellow having an Aliyah, where again it says he needs to stand. There's a major, major question. Baruch Hashem, we are all gesund. All of Klal Yisrael should be gesund. And we know the halacha, that you have an aliyah, you need to stand. But not everybody is so fortunate. We have people in old age homes. We have people in wheelchairs. He wants an aliyah. He's able to have an aliyah. What's the problem? He's not able to stand. And it says in Shulchan Aruch that you need to stand. This starts a major, major discussion in the poskim. And the crux of the issue is one nakuda. Yes, it says that the oila, the one who's having aliyah, needs to stand. Why does he need to stand? Is it because there's a din directed at the oila, because you're having an aliyah, you need to stand? Or is it simply because The halacha says when you have an aliyah, you're meant to lane together with the Baal Korah. So the same way that the Baal Korah is meant to stand, so if you have an aliyah and you're meant to say it with him, you also need to stand. What's the difference? The difference is as follows. The halacha says, ideally, you're meant to lane together with your tzaddik. Very much appreciated. Thank you very, very much. You're meant to stand, you're meant to read together with the Baal Korah if you're able to. Says the Mishnah Berurah and the Poskim, many Poskim hold, this is a din l'chatchila. You're meant to read together with him. A summa, he can't read the Torah. A person who, for whatever the reason, can't read with, it's not ma'akav to read with. Now, if the reason why the oile needs to stand is merely because ideally you're meant to say it together with the Baal Korah, so if you're saying it with him, you get the same din as the Baal Korah that you need to stand. If that's the case, what will I tell this old man in the wheelchair? He wants an aliyah. He's desperate to have an aliyah. The tat is yutzat. Schon 90 Jahre beschreibt an aliyah, jeden yutzat. Jetzt nicht, because he's in a wheelchair. So what will I tell him to do? Why do you need to stand? Because we expect you to say it with. But you know halacha that it's ma'akiv to say it with. So I'll tell him, have an aliyah, don't say the words with. You won't get the same din as the Baal Korah. And you can have an aliyah sitting down, and we'll roll the Sefer Torah down, far enough down that you'll be able to have an aliyah. But if there's a halacha directed specifically at the oiler, that because you're an oiler you have to stand, then we're going to have to say to him very apologetically, I'm very sorry, we cannot give you an aliyah. This is something for Rabbonim to decide in the situation. There's one more nakuda. What do you call even by Torah?
In that very law in Tafresh Tzadik, he brings the MEIR, but if Mashen came to Torah, for us, but the Eved Gam Ken Yotzik.
But the Eved Yotza doesn't mean but the Eved you're allowed to do it. The Ein El means that the din you're not allowed to do it. But if you did so, you don't need to relay. That's what it means. It doesn't mean you're allowed to go and do it. We won't give permission for the person to do it.
And not saying along with the shot is not a big Eved?
No, because that says mufurish that we allow a person to have an aliyah if he can't. We say explicitly. Now there's one more din, and that's us, the tzibur. The Gemara doesn't say anywhere that the tzibur needs to stand for Kriyas HaTorah. But the Shulchan Aruch brings down Maram Rottenberg, who held that the tzibur should also stand. Now, this is every shul, every killer, every person, and their minig. If your minig is to sit, sit. Your minig is to do whichever way you want, whichever way you want. There's three different minhagim and klalas. So those who say the tzibur should sit, those who say we do whatever you like, and those who follow Maram Rottenberg to stand. The question is, if you're following Maram Rottenberg and you're standing, does that allow you to lean? Or if you're following Maram Rottenberg, you need to literally stand like the Baal Korah. This is not written in the Maram Rottenberg, and it's actually a machlokas. There's a Shuvas B'Samim Rosh, which either was the Rosh or wasn't the Rosh, but the Shuvas B'Samim Rosh says that the tzibur, according to Maram Rottenberg, has to stand and not lean. The Pri Megadim says, Maram Rottenberg says to stand, okay, but I don't have a din of a Baal Korah, I'm allowed to lean. What's the machlokas between the B'Samim Rosh and the Pri Megadim? I'm not passing it as I'm explaining the concept here. You see from the Achronim, there's a big machlokas in the understanding of Maram Rottenberg. The Gemara says that you should stand for Kriyas HaTorah, the Baal Korah, because the Pasuk says, Va'ata poi amoid imodi, you should stand here with me. Some Achronim understand Maram Rottenberg to mean that he read the Gemara different. He holds the Pasuk, Va'ata poi amoid imodi, refers to the Baal Korah and the Tzibur. And others say no. Maram Rottenberg holds like the other Rishonim, that the Pasuk Va'ata Poya Moidi Modi is talking about the Baal Korah. The Maram Rottenberg holds Mishum Kavod Torah, the Tzibur should also stand. This is official machloikas, how to understand the Maram Rottenberg. It would seem that the machloikas, the Psamim Rosh and the Pri Megadim, depends on this. If Maram Rottenberg understood Va'ata Poya Moidi Modi is talking to the whole Tzibur, so the whole Tzibur is going to get the same din, as the Balkaira. So says the Psalm Rosh, you can't lean. Prima Godim understands Maram Rottenberg. He's not saying that I have the same din as the Balkaira. Balkaira has his din of Ata Poya Moedimodi. I have a chiv of Kovarat Torah. If I have a chiv of Kovarat Torah, the Prima Godim allows us to sit down. The Eibush helpful, we should be another time to learn the other dinim which are relevant over here.